Well, for me, I think the big thing when anybody says or talks about the question and answer approach, I go back to, based on the research that I did on the history of mentoring, was that was an approach that was developed, founded by Socrates. And he used the question and answer approach in a lot of the things that he did. And what I see with that approach is that not only does it apply to mentoring, but it's also a great technique for leaders who are working with employees and are attempting to enhance, develop their critical thinking skills. So while I have my own practice of mentoring, and it's been in existence now for 10 plus years. I was in leadership positions before that. And what I found and it's interesting how life evolves, but what I found was I was actually using a question and answer approach with the people that I was providing leadership for, but I didn't really know what it was at the time. And now, when I look at sort of the conversations that I have with individuals, it's usually premised in a lot of situations where I use the question and answer approach without even thinking about it.
True. Yeah. And I think there's something to be said for the way in which the question is asked, whether in a mentoring relationship, whether it's the mentee asking the mentor or the mentor asking the mentee. It's the way in which we go about asking that question that's important. And that's what sparks for me right now. I'm thinking what would be helpful for us to explore this is, let's take a look at some of the ways that this question and answer approach can be used. And I'm going to go back to what I just said about how the question is being asked, okay? If the way it's being asked has this tonal, why'd you do that? Right? Or why would you think about doing it that way? It's a question and it's going to get an answer. However, it's a very quick way to shut things down. And the why question in particular, it can be taken in a lot of different ways. I know in appreciative inquiry, one of the techniques is ask 5 whys, and you tend to unearth things. And I remember working with a group, and we were attempting to take a look at this notion of community development. It was a group of library technicians and library managers, and they were going through a bit of a union upheaval. And there was a little bit of loggerhead, they were bumping up against each other. And we brought in this appreciative inquirer. And I remember this one day, we said, well, why don't you interview each other and use the 5 why technique? So the one technician ended up with a manager, and I could hear it out of the corner. They go, why are you doing what you're doing? Okay, so why are you doing that? So, and then why are you doing that? And I have to just sort of get over there and say, we got to do this from an appreciative point of view, not from, okay, I'm trying to solve a problem and I want to understand what's going on. We've got to look at it from that point of view. So I just use that because I learned that lesson again, and the tone and the way in which we ask the question is really important. Thoughts about that?
No, you're absolutely right, because the approach that I typically take with the question and answer approach is to frame the question and the response in the context of a question. So what would happen if we were to do X? And then wait to see if I get a response. And if I don't get a response, then I'll reframe it or rephrase it again to say, what would happen if we were to do X, Y, and Z? So now I'm taking actual potentially answers to the questions that I've already come up with, and I'm floating them out there in the context of a question. And the idea behind that is that I want the person that I'm having the conversation with, I want them to engage their critical thinking skills to start to think their way through. And if I give them the answer without it being in the context of a question, I'm doing all the work for them. And that's not the idea, nor is it the intent of this particular approach.
Often you've got to live through the silence of the question asked. And one day, I asked a question of a group of people. I was facilitating at the time versus mentoring at this day, okay. And I asked the question, and I actually had a clock on the wall, so I was facing the clock and the group. It was 2 minutes and 36 seconds before someone said something. That would have to have been the longest 2 minutes and 36 seconds of my life. But after I got people to understand what I just did, then we got into this true nature of the question and answer in the group format. I understand facilitating, but you also just brought it up, is that when you ask the question, is waiting through the silence as the mentor and the mentee, right? And sometimes the mentee also has to learn about the silence that goes with the question, because they may be wound up and they're asking a question and they don't get an immediate response. It's not that the mentor doesn't want to respond. It's that it was such a great question. I need to figure out how I want. But all of a sudden you get another question. Got another question.
Mm-hmm.
You start bouncing around, and I know that's when the mentor's got to go. Whoa, let's slow this down. Let's take a breath and let's figure out what's going on, right? So from the question and answer point of view, is there another way that we can look at the question and answer approach?
Sort of looking at it from, I describe it as a way of life, is that the more that you get into the question and answer and you start to practice it and do it on a daily basis, that it becomes a way of life where you're able to ask those questions on an ongoing basis, but you're also open to the aspect that the mentee can also ask questions of you in a similar context, and you need to be prepared to be able to, not put your hand up and say, "Just a minute, I'm the mentor, I do the question asking," but to be able to be, open and receptive enough to be able to say, okay, good, you're getting me to think critically, and that's good. That's what's going to make this a great working, a great mentoring relationship.
And I think that the mentor is asking some of the initial questions and getting the flywheel moving, but eventually what we would like is the mentee asking the questions to get the flywheel moving and being able to sort of wax on, wax off. Right?
Yeah.
It's that kind of idea, because really the mentor is saying, I've got some lived experience. I'd love to share it with you, but I'd like to know what it is you're looking for, because I don't want to just start talking about this and that and everything else. Now, I appreciate there's stories that get shared, and that sparks some thoughts and moves it all forward and all that, which brings up for me one of the really important reasons that we do the question and answer is the notion of movement.
Mm-hmm.
And the question and answer allows for this notion of the physical movement. People probably notices that I sort of pop in and out because when I'm talking and I'm sharing or I'm asking a question, there's movement, because I'm wanting to make it physical for me to really embrace what it is that I'm doing. I'm putting some energy. I have a question for you, and I think I'll ask it this way. It's not the same, but there's also the movement of what does it fit? Where does the question fit in what it is that's going to take place? I think it's called the fitness. What does it lead to? And a great question leads to something that has this, not only the physical aspect, but this notion of fitness, the lead to, the leadership aspect of that sort of goes, oh, okay. And the critical thinking, yes, but also the imagination. Oh, okay. And you start to see dots getting connected and all that. And a great question, right, can do that with the answer. So I wanted to just add movement as a word into this as well.
And I think, when we reflect back on the conversation in the first session, the first hour that we were together with Desiree and Yvonne, was that very same thing that you just described was taking place.
Yep.
And it was so powerful because you could just see uh, it's like a little flower blossoming into a big flower, but you can see a conversation that started so small all of a sudden grew and grew and grew, and it became something that was relevant and large. But when it first started, it wasn't that.
Well, this question and answer, the tool in and of itself, the technique that goes with it. Is there anything that we could share right now that would be able to help those who are mentoring to continuous improvement or continuous strengthening what they're already doing? Do you have any thought about that?
Well, what I typically, when I have the conversation with mentors, prospective mentors, and we talk about, the question and answer approach, and the examples I typically give are, you have a situation that your mentee or your protege is dealing with. It's to be able to take and frame things in the context of a question. So you conceivably, you could just tell them what they need to do in order to solve the problem. And I'll take a sidebar here and tell a little story that illustrates that. So I was actually meeting with a president, a CEO of a family-owned business, and I was in there with the idea in mind that I was going to have a conversation around mentoring and the value it could bring to his organization. And so we're sitting there. And I want to create the picture of him behind his desk with, computer monitors, telephones, all sorts of things all around, and then off to the left side of his main desk area was a smaller table and a bunch of chairs where obviously he goes and sits to have conversations with people. And so invites me to come and sit, which I do, and we were having a coffee and we're starting to chat. And what ends up happening is one of his staff, one of his employees, comes to the door and knocks and says, "Hey, boss, I'm not quite sure how to fix this problem." And so the president says, "Tell me a little bit more." And so he tells him, and he says, "Well, we had that same thing last week, and I gave you some suggestions on how you could fix it. So here's what you have to do. I'll share this with you again." And he rattles off 5 or 6 steps that the employee has to go through. Employee says, "Thanks, boss," and away he goes. And so I asked the question, how many times a week does that same problem resurrect itself? And how many times a week do you get asked the same question by your employee? And he goes, "I can't count that high." And I said, "So what would happen if you were to bring your employee in and sit him in this very chair that I'm in, and you said to him, what would happen if we were to do this, this, or this?" And you say no more. And you get him to start to think his way through that. And long story short, he actually started to implement that style, that question and answer approach. And as a result of doing that, the payback for him was it freed up a lot of his time to do other things where he's not troubleshooting and solving problems when he's got great staff that could be doing that themselves. So
Yes.
it was in the context, and I hope, for our listeners that the story helped a bit to be able to understand that, but it was definitely not giving the answers, but framing things in the context. So what would happen if we were to do this, this, or this? And when you said, those 3 things that you said, what would happen if you did 1, 2, or 3? Well, 1, 2, and 3 are actually answers to the question, but now you're forcing him to think about outcomes. So if he does 1, what's the outcome? If he does 2, what's the outcome? If he does 3, what's the outcome? And getting that employee to start to think in that context is going to make the employee's life better, because there's going to be a sense of pride in, ooh, I solved that on my own. And with the boss or with the president of the company, it's going to be, geez, what am I going to do now? I got all this extra time on my hands.
I guess what they could do is turn to mentoring.
Yeah.
Mentor someone else.
Yeah.
Well, for me, the word question is also helpful here because it has the word quest in it. So the question is really a quest. Is I'm on a quest and I need the answer to my quest so that I can move on, move on, move on, move on. And for some people, it might be a stepwise 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Other people, it might be a weaving back and forth and up and down. Oh, hang on, I got to go backwards to be able to get forwards. Right? There's a quest, and I'm not going to go so far as to go, well, it's the hero's story, all right, even though that's a very prevalent story across the world. It is the notion of the person asking the question, the questioner, right, story. And that story, once learned, to your point, is one that you can use to be able to share with others. And you become now, the questioner becomes the mentor for other people. And there is a lot of livingness to that. Doug and I use words like deeper and richer, because once you understand what you've learned and you can educate others, then it deepens what you have learned and it deepens your conversation with others. And that in itself is of great value to the workplace, to organizations, to the people that you're interacting with. So that quest in question is important. Maybe someday I'll dive into what ion means, the chemical particle at some point. But let's leave it with the quest today. Anything else about questions and answers that we need to touch on at this point in time?
No, I don't think so. The only thing, I guess, is I know for my son and my mentoring practice, understanding what that is and looking continually researching in that, what are some different approaches. I encourage those that are listening in to do that as well. It's a way to continuously learn as a mentor, and that's a large part of your growth.
So the one part I would add with question and answer is, one of the great things is that it does lead to something that could be a bond between the people. It could be a way to deepen a working relationship that may go beyond a bond. The bond could turn into the friendship, right? Some mentoring arrangements can become friendly, right? And in that, there is other aspects we have to think about as well. But this notion of deepening even a professional relationship. There's also this notion of being able to help the person see something that they didn't see before. And that is very helpful, very, very helpful, all right? Very, very helpful for the person who's asking the question, because now they can see it from different angles. And when you get to educate what it is that you've learned, then you've strengthened the angle that has the, let's use a return on learning language, because now it's a return on educating language. Now it's a return on integrating language because of what it is you've done. So there's so much that can happen in this use of question and answer. And if that's a way in which to summarize the importance of it, then please, I encourage you, and I know Doug's nodding his head, we encourage you to strengthen your way of doing that. And maybe someday in the near future, we'll actually put together a short course on the question answer approach, and dig around in ourselves and ask more questions about how to ask questions, and more ways in which to give an answer and see what we come up with to strengthen the community, the international mentoring community.